Hi, David.
Hi, Bob. How are you?
Can't complain. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thank you. Thank you.
Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available both via streaming video and as audio podcast. You're David Brophy, senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Sydney in Australia, where you are.
That's right.
And I'm really looking forward to this conversation because, we've all heard a lot, I think, about what the Chinese government is doing to the Uyghur population in Xinjiang in Western China. But I have to say, I still don't have a super clear picture of exactly what's going on there. And I don't have a super clear picture of what the Chinese government's motivations and goals are. So to the extent that we can, I'd like to shed light on those. And I have to say, you're one of the few people I think I've talked to. Maybe you're the only person I've talked to who can claim to be something of an expert on this part of China. You wrote a book published by Harvard University Press called Uyghur Nation, Reform and Revolution on the Russia-China Frontier. Why don't we start out by just asking you to give us a little background that would maybe help understand why this is happening at all. So this is a part of China that I gather came under Chinese rule as long ago as the 18th century, but has remained for a long time pretty ethnically distinct. There's a big Turkic-speaking population, which is what the Uyghurs are. They are Muslims by and large. What else would you need to know about the recent history of the area to start putting this whole thing in context?
Right. So you're correct to say that this is a region that was incorporated into the Qing Empire in the 18th century, and the Qing exercised a pretty hands-off form of rule for most of that, the subsequent century. And they lost control of it a few times. There was a slight turn in policy towards the end of the 19th century when they tried as a sort of a last-ditch effort to integrate this region into the empire to pursue a policy of direct rule, a more assimilationist cultural policy with some similarities, you could argue, with the situation that we face today. But of course, the Qing then was a very weak state, and ultimately, fell apart itself within a few years. Xinjiang was then, you could say, independent for much of the first half of the 20th century, but independent in Chinese hands. That's to say, it was governed by Chinese officials who were trying to really insulate this region from the political turmoil of the Chinese interior. So it was only really in the 1940s that parties like the Nationalist Party had much of a presence or control in the region. There were also bids for independence on the part of the local population at that time. So there were a couple of efforts to establish an East Turkestan Republic. Now, this term East Turkestan is quite important. East Turkestan obviously implies a West Turkestan. And generally speaking, this area that we sometimes call Central Asia, part of it falling within the Russian Empire and then becoming part of the Soviet Union. So all the stans, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, that's what's generally recognized as West Turkestan. And East Turkestan is this part that's ended up inside China. And culturally, linguistically, historically, Xinjiang has a lot in common with those regions that are now independent. So you could say that, the fall of the Soviet Union and the emergence of these independent republics was a fairly significant event in the history of the wider region. Now, on the eve of the Red Army's intrusion into Xinjiang, there was actually a Soviet-backed...
And this is when, roughly?
Well, they didn't really get out there until 1949. At that time, the region was a province, technically, of the Chinese Republic, but there had been, for the preceding few years, there'd been a Soviet-backed uprising in the north that had created the second East Turkestan Republic. which certainly expressed a lot of local aspirations for autonomy and self-government, but was also very much tied to Soviet foreign policy. So Stalin's policy was then to push the leadership of this East Turkestan Republic into negotiation with the Chinese communists. So that was essentially what led to this region being incorporated into the People's Republic of China without too much of a fight. It's not to say there wasn't some local resistance, but generally speaking, the local elite, those who were aligned with the nationalists fled the region as the nationalists did elsewhere. And what you had then was a local political elite, many of whom were members, in fact, of the Soviet Communist Party, identified with that.
So the ones who had aligned with the losing side of the Civil War, side that wound up in Taiwan, kind of left. And so you had, you were left with elites who were pretty aligned with the communists at that point.
I mean, they had aspirations. There was a difficult negotiation in the 1950s because, I mean, these were people who were hoping possibly to emerge with something like a Soviet Republic of Uyghur or something like that. And the fact was that the nationalities policy of the Chinese Communist Party was even more centralizing than in the case of the Soviet Union. So they weren't willing to go that far to grant that level of autonomy. So what you ended up with a kind of compromise.
So from the beginning, were the Uyghurs kind of hoping for more in the way of autonomy than wound up being acceptable from the point of view of the Chinese government?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And so in the middle of the 1950s, when you had this nationwide campaign, the anti-rightist campaign, it was known as elsewhere in China, this really turned into a campaign against local nationalism in which a lot of these Uyghur elites who'd been associated with the Second East Turkestan Republic, they were marginalized, sidelined, because many of them did have these aspirations to work within the system, but carve out a greater level of autonomy than they were being offered by the party at that time.
Now, it is still called, is it not technically the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region? Is that the technical name?
That is exactly the technical name. Yeah, the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region.
But the Chinese don't want to accept all the connotations of that, I gather, the Chinese government.
Well, the term autonomy here isn't necessarily what you or I might understand by autonomy. The autonomous regions, they do have the ability to pass local legislation that differs from the rest of China, but any such legislation has to be approved by the center. So effectively voiding their ability to diverge from the will of the center. There's certain cultural provisions in the constitution that technically allow non-Chinese populations to promote their culture and preserve their language. And there's been certain affirmative action measures to, for example, facilitate entry into higher education. Up until recently, there was less enforcement of the birth control policies. And these are the types of things that are being eroded now in the current situation, where people feel that a lot of this stuff, some of it looks quite, reasonable on paper, has really become a dead letter. As the pendulum has really swung in the direction of assimilationism. That
last point is kind of ironic. I mean, there's an allegation now that there is coerced sterilization or some form of population growth suppression of that sort. Until not that long ago, it was kind of the other way around. In other words, the Han Chinese were subjected to a limit of, I think, one child per family for a long time. The Uyghurs were exempt from that. But is that?
Yeah, correct. I mean, there was a certain latitude. So in the cities, generally speaking, non-Chinese people were able to have more than one child. And in the countryside, there was really no limits at all. And it is ironic because, of course, China is now very anxious about its the the demographic situation and the aging population. And so they are moving towards a complete relaxation of any population control measures. But in Xinjiang, it's gone in the other direction, that they have started to enforce this policy.
Now, can I just, as long as we're there, I don't want to get deeply yet into the question of like what exactly is going on there, but I mean, as you know, a couple of terms that are being used are cultural genocide and genocide. So far as I can tell, the genocide claim seems to be tied to the idea of coerced sterilization. I mean, to the extent that I haven't looked into it deeply. But do we know that is going on? I mean, one thing you've said is that the Uyghurs have now been brought under the same restrictions applied to the Han population in terms of birth. But is there not something beyond that going on, or do we just not know for sure? I mean, is there anything the Chinese government is acknowledging, or at least that we have reason to believe is happening?
Oh, I mean, they're very open about the fact that they are promoting the use of sterilization techniques and IUDs and
but coercively. So I mean, it's involuntarily applied.
You're in a situation, I think, where it's very hard to say no in this environment, and there's various forms of pressure that are applied to people, and opting out or showing a recalcitrance towards these types of campaigns is something that could very easily land someone in under the eye of the the security state at the moment, and I think that's borne out by some of the testimony that has come out of women who've been able to get out of Xinjiang, women who, we would probably consider to be, past childbearing age are still, still having this pressure applied to them to go and, have these devices inserted and so on.
And just are these women who have had children but reached what is deemed the limit throughout China, or are they saying to some women, if you're a Uyghur, you can't have kids at all? Or do we know?
Well, no, there's a limit. And, I should say that the limit is still, it's higher than one child. So it's 2 in the cities, 3 in the countryside.
And it's at that point that the sterilization there's pressure
will kick in. Yeah.
And does that happen to other populations as well, or just the Uyghurs?
Oh, this does occur elsewhere in China, certainly. What we're seeing in terms of the sort of the high numbers in this region reflects the fact that this has been a sharp turn to apply this policy in places where it has not been applied or has been only intermittently applied in the past, and so that's why it's being felt as such a significant impact on the Uyghur and other non-Han communities. And then you also have to take into account the fact that in this, political turmoil that the region has been through in the last 3-4 years, that is going to deter people from having children as well. So you do then, the combined effect then has been a significant, noticeable drop in the birth rate in the region.
Okay. So to get back to the history, I gather that some sort of nationalist or separatist impulse must have persisted or resurfaced, because if you ask the government, why do you have to crack down on these people, they will say, these are separatists. They're trying to tear the country apart. They've been associated with terrorists and so on, right?
Right. Yeah. The dominant sort of motivating discourse around this policies is very much associated primarily with terrorism, justified in terms of counter-terrorism. But in the background, of course, you have the more long-running anxiety about what they call separatism and efforts to remove Xinjiang from the fold and create some sort of Uyghur state. And that sort of sentiment certainly does exist in Xinjiang. It's been something that there's been a sort of a alternation between hardline, softline policies for a long time now. There was a string of violent incidents in 2014, which seems to have been the moment that the hardliners really got the upper hand at this point, and the more sort of gradualist approaches to assimilating the population, cultivating an identification with the Chinese state and the Chinese language and so on, the party state really ran out of patience on that front, and has clearly decided that a much more fast-paced, coercive approach to this ideological indoctrination and cultural assimilation is necessary to resolve this situation.
And was the kind of shift in policy a response to specific terrorist acts? I gather you don't have a lot of AK-47s floating around among civilians in China. I gather the one big attack I've read about was like a knife attack involving a lot of people, right? They managed to, I guess, kill a couple of dozen people with knives, which isn't that easy. But what?
Sure.
What?
Yeah. No, you're totally right. It is a very demilitarized place. This is not the kind of place where people have guns. And it's also not the kind of place where people have much space to organize and build opposition networks around any form of politics, be it violent or non-violent. The Uyghurs just have not really had much space to breathe. But you do occasionally have these incidents which are very hard to connect to any kind of organization, but were 2013, 2014, you had a couple of incidents of people, driving cars into crowds, then setting off homemade bombs. The knife attack you refer to, you're probably referring to the incident in Kunming in the south of China, where, the circumstances are often a little bit vague because we don't really have the ability to, there isn't investigative journalism that can really get to the bottom of these incidents, but it's possible that these were people heading towards Southeast Asia as a way to claim asylum, got stuck in South China and were somehow, recruited to this plan to go on a knife attack at the train station. So this is quite a shocking event. We shouldn't downplay the fact that, ordinary Chinese civilians have lost their lives in these incidents. But what the Chinese government has done with this is to construct a framework in which almost any kind of political opposition is deemed to be terrorism. So you'll read these reports saying, in the past 20 years, there's been, thousands of incidents or thousands of terrorists have been rounded up. And this often includes events that look like much more spontaneous conflicts to do with development issues, land disputes, or outbreaks of communal violence, such as we saw in 2009 in the regional capital of Urumqi. Now there are people abroad in places like Syria or possibly also in Pakistan, Afghanistan. It's hard to say. There are people there who've come out of Xinjiang and have some notion that they might be able to receive some military training and one day go back to China and do something. I think it's pretty far-fetched, actually. China really has quite a lockdown on the entries and exits from the region. Sometimes these groups will claim responsibility for something that happens inside China, but no one's ever really been able to demonstrate much connection between what goes on outside and what goes on inside.
Okay, so before we turn to the whole internment issue, do you have a take on how sincere the government is in claiming that its motivation is fear of terrorism and separatism? I live in the United States. I have seen governments overreact to terrorism by my lights, at least. Like I have seen what I considered a very disproportionate response that was kind of deeply felt in a sense. Who knows what they're actually thinking in the councils of government, but the American people were kind of on board, right? They were like, this seems about right. And so Do you have a sense? I mean, what do you think the actual agenda of the Chinese government is? Is it what they say? We don't want terror. We don't like terrorism, and we don't want a chunk of the country breaking off. Or is there kind of a broader agenda here, or what?
Right. I mean, I think that what you just said is relevant to this situation. I mean, I do think that this falls within there's a lot of family resemblance here, I think, to the way that governments all around the world have responded to this issue of terrorism in the last 20 years. And I think that it's created a security and policy elite in many countries who may well feel that this is necessary and justified, and that so I think it's very hard to say exactly what is going on in the minds of Chinese officials, but I would imagine that some of them really do believe that this is all necessary to prevent the descent of Xinjiang into more violent state. But it dovetails with a lot of other objectives that have been discussed for some time. Even leaving aside the question of terrorism, there's been a dissatisfaction among policy elites in China with the existing framework of nationalities policy. This idea that the system of autonomous regions, now I just talked about the fact that it doesn't really grant much autonomy at all. Well, in the eyes of certain policymakers, the problem is that it gives too much autonomy, right? And these structures have prevented the integration and the intermingling of the various different ethnic groups of China to form some kind of unified Chinese nation, which has always been the objective. And 10 years ago, there was an open policy debate on this question, and the idea of simply abolishing these autonomous regions and doing away with some of the structures that granted certain nominal privileges to non-Chinese groups and so on the basis that this distinctive national identity that was being preserved within this framework was becoming a national security issue. Right now, that was actually quite a sensitive discussion to have, because it really went to the heart of the Chinese constitution and the policies that were laid down by Mao and his comrades, and ultimately the party decided that they didn't want to change this. They didn't want to admit that there was a problem there. But on the ground, you've seen a lot of shifts in the direction of this what they call the second generation nationalities policy.
And this goes beyond the Uyghurs. I mean, there are a number of minority ethnic populations, and is the government, broadly speaking, trying to do what it might call assimilation, but other people might call, kind of wiping out a cultural heritage?
Well, I think that the case of the Uyghurs is the extreme case at the moment, and it is a sort of a testing ground for these sorts of policies. But there's a general mood, I think, within Chinese officialdom that is out of patience with tolerance for too much ethnic diversity, and is, you see incidents crop up in places that have been relatively quiet over the past few decades. So, for example, Inner Mongolia, which is regarded by the party as a relatively safe space. Mm-hmm. They don't see the types of issues there that they see in Xinjiang, but nonetheless, there has been moves recently to restrict the scope of Mongolian language schooling, and that's provoked a response from local Mongols who feel that they can look at a place like Xinjiang and see where the direction of this kind of policy might. I've heard that
there's even some Mongolian parents have kept their children out of school in protest in some cases because they've basically increased the ratio of Han Chinese instruction.
That's right. Yeah.
To Mongolian language instruction.
Yeah, that's right.
So, okay. So, what would you say is their ultimate goal? I mean, do they want to sever the connection of the Uyghur people to their native language and to Islam, for example, in the extreme case?
Look, I do think that the long-term future of the Uyghur language is now in some danger, because I think it is being increasingly stigmatized and marginalized from public spaces. Now, it's not to say that it is being completely banned. If you go into a bookshop in Xinjiang, you'll still find books in Uyghur. There is certainly a very stringent policing of the kinds of historical and cultural narratives that you'll find in those books. So the space that's existed for the last sort of 20 years or so, in which intellectuals have been able to kind of negotiate a distinctive set of, national narratives, folk heroes, the sorts of symbols of Uyghur culture that, may serve as points of pride and, inspiration for maintaining a distinctive Uyghur identity in the face of this pressure from the Chinese state. That has really come under attack. So we've seen things like, people who edited textbooks of Uyghur literature for school children being arrested and given life sentences because all of a sudden this material, which was published with government approval 20 years ago, has been found to contain, dangerous, subversive messages.
Which again, it sounds to me like the message is an attempt to sustain the kind of the national mythology of a people. I mean, nations have national mythology. Totally. So it's like if somebody tried to convince us that George Washington wasn't a great guy, which, as it happens, a lot of people are trying to do, but that's kind of a coincidence.
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, on the question of Islam, I think it's worth talking about for a second as well. I mean, I think it would be too much to say that China is trying to eradicate Islam. But one of the slogans that they've raised in the context of this campaign is the Sinification of Islam, the Sinification of all religion in China, actually, but Sinification of Islam in particular. And that is this notion that Islam is potentially out of line with Chinese values, the values of Chinese civilization. And there needs to be some kind of process of integrating these things. And so anything associated with Islam that hints too much at the foreign connections, the sort of the wider cultural world that Uyghurs participate in by virtue of being Muslims, that is becoming, that's deemed suspicious. I will give you an example. When I was in Xinjiang in 2017, I was driving around and I saw some commercial buildings that, just as a sort of a touch of Islamic architecture, had little domes on top of them. I saw people up there with sledgehammers, smashing these domes because they didn't want the landscape or the built environment to give off these connotations that you were in some different kind of space that,
and these were just ornaments on non-religious buildings.
Just ornaments on commercial buildings. Yeah. So that's the level at which this is being policed.
And then, of course, there are satellite photos that seem to show that where there once were mosques, there are not mosques. What's your sense for that? I mean, I gather that's reliable evidence. Do you have a sense for the scale of this or what?
Yeah. So some of those satellite photos, you need to look closely at some of these. There's been cases I've been aware of, for example, where people have claimed that an entire mosque has been demolished. What has happened in some of those cases is there might be a mosque and then a more recent architectural addition that has a more, South Asian or Middle Eastern style archway or that kind of thing. And that is what's been demolished. But it is the case that some mosques have been closed or renovated, turned into, there's a case in Kashgar I know of where it was turned into a cafe. There's been a recent report of a mosque in the north, in Ili, that's been turned into a hotel. The other thing that's been going on is the erasure of shrines. And I think possibly more so than mosques, it's these Sufi shrines that have been these gathering points. Some of them, would host very large collective gatherings, say, at a particular point in the year. people would sort of go out often in remote locations. There's been a gradual sort of tightening around these sites. So you started to see some of them being closed off. If you went out to them, police might stop you on the road. So I'm basically trying to discourage people from visiting these places. But now it does seem to be the case that some of these have actually been destroyed. I mean, that's judging now, from the satellite imagery.
Sufi isn't the dominant strain of Islam there, is it, or is it?
Well, I mean, when you're talking about Central Asia, it's very hard to disentangle, Sufism from Islam more generally, because it really has been the dominant tradition within, Orthodox Islamic practice for, you could say for certainly for the last 700-800 years. I mean, the region, to a large extent, was converted to Islam by the activities of Sufi missionaries who are out on the frontier, going and, converting the non-Muslims and so on. And, the Islamic rulers in that region would all patronize Sufi brotherhoods. At certain points, the Sufi brotherhoods have actually held some political power in this region too. Now, of course, Sufism, as in the rest of the Islamic world, it was critiqued by reformers and modernists from the early 20th century onwards. So you couldn't say that Sufism is as prominent as it was, say, 100 years ago, but some of these Sufi brotherhoods survive, and this practice of shrine pilgrimage is something that is very popular, whether or not people even think of it as a form of Sufism or not. You talk to people and you ask them about Sufism, and they'll say, what? But it's just what you do as a Muslim in this in this region, particularly in the south, which is full of these shrines.
Okay, so is the government's goal? I mean, I gather with Christianity, there are government-approved Christian churches, and then there are congregations that meet secretly because they wouldn't meet with government approval. I mean, is it trying to create an officially approved version of Islam that is accommodating to its needs? Does that seem to be the goal?
Yeah, so that's been, it's been the case for quite some time now that,
the mosques require
approval, and the imams are supposed to have. Now, it's not the case that this always applies, but there are these training institutes that imams are ideally supposed to go through, and there is monitoring of the sermons, and recently, they've instituted practices like sort of registering people as they go in to pray. I think that's having an effect of deterring people from visiting the mosque, because, you don't want to get a reputation as someone who is too devout, too pious. And so yes, I mean, it as part of this idea of the sinification of Islam, there is this, because of course, Uyghur Islam, there are Islamic traditions, there are Chinese-speaking Muslims, there are, Islam exists all throughout China. And you have these communities of Chinese-speaking Muslims, for example, who are, they do receive some of the same suspicion from officials, but the fact that they practice their religion primarily with the much greater use of Chinese language, for example, that's sort of being held up as a better model than this Uyghur Islam, which is, looks too foreign from the point of view of Chinese.
So I was going to ask, how would Islam in Xinjiang have to change to meet with the approval of the government? It sounds like one thing is it would prefer that they spoke Chinese when they practice it, right? I mean, the government would much prefer that. Is there a short answer to the question of how would the government like the practice of Islam to? I'm sure they would like zero explicitly political content that has the vaguest connotation of separatism, of course.
Sure.
It sounds like they'd rather these people speak Chinese. What else?
That's a really interesting question. I've read some articles that lay out a really, really ambitious, almost unbelievably sort of syncretic idea of what a Sinified Islam should look like. I mean, people talking about how, this should be taking things from Chinese traditions like Confucianism and Taoism and so on. And to me, that's just, I find it really implausible that they could ever really attempt something like that. So in terms of the doctrinal level, it's hard to really get a grip on what's going on there at the moment in terms of, but there have been, we know that there are, for example, commentaries on the Quran that were produced by Uyghur scholars of Islam that were, had approval to be published and so on, that have been removed from circulation.
Mm-hmm.
And, newer commentaries being produced. And then people kind of have to go through and say, okay, well, what's the difference here? What didn't they like about those earlier editions and so on? It's sort of, it can be sort of quite difficult to really get a grip on. And they're not really saying very much in terms of how they really want to, shape the interpretation of these religious texts at the moment. So it's a really good question, but I don't have a great answer to it at the moment.
Okay. So you mentioned people not wanting to get a reputation for being too devout. And I gather one reason is that's a way to wind up being involuntarily confined. I mean,
right.
So
yeah.
There are these things that the government refers to as education or camps or whatever, and they have, I saw somewhere a report where they let a camera person in to view what looked, like a classroom. That's their version of what's going on in there. Of course,
right.
That was what they chose to show the camera person. But it seems there are a few questions like. So what is going on inside these things? On how large a scale is it happening? How many people are forced into them? How much time do they spend there? And then also the thing I started with, what are the criteria for selecting people who are confined? I've heard that, we know that the Chinese government is, not shy about surveillance, does a lot of record keeping in terms of what its citizens are up to. And I gather that, like, if your family, has bought 3 copies of the Quran in the last month, that's the kind of thing that might get you in trouble. So, but maybe I'm wrong. What do we know, first of all, on the criteria for confinement?
Okay. Right. So the Chinese state has moved from this, and it's an evolution that policing practices around the world have actually undergone. It's just that China is really taking the application to extreme. But this idea, and to me, it's really a sort of a bogus pseudoscience, but this de-radicalization discourse that you can identify people who might be entering onto a pathway to radicalization by certain changes in their behavior, or so on. So that's one set of factors, for example. So indications that you're becoming more pious, that if you've given up alcohol, or you're not smoking anymore, or you're, even just showing a sort of a disinterest in, what the party and government is saying, so people, if you don't have a radio at home, if you don't watch the TV news, these are kinds of things that can attract suspicion. There is, certainly a lot of this is also to do with connections internationally. So if you've traveled abroad, or if you've sent your children to study abroad, and particularly, again, this is where the sort of the Islamophobia comes in, particularly if it's been to Islamic countries or countries that are identified as, places where people get radicalized. So those are some of the things that have affected the population broadly. At the level of the intellectual and political elite, there's been a sort of a Stalinist witch hunt for people who are, they might be party members, but they're come to be regarded as, insufficiently loyal. The word for these people is two-faced people. That is to say, they might say the right thing when they're at work or at a meeting or something, but then they go home and then they,
so
they
these are
Muslim,
these are Muslim Uyghur elites who purport to be, what you might say faithful citizens, but are now under suspicion. And there's more and more kind of, I guess, informal kind of searching for them in a sense. So like the sense that you should be alert for these turncoats.
Yeah, and it's sort of natural in a sense that there'd be this kind of scapegoating. That how could this situation have gotten out of hand? It must be because there are these people inside the system who are white-anting it from within, and so the suspicion falls then on these academics, these party members, and so on. Not exclusively Uyghur, I should say. I mean, there are people from the other communities who've ended up branded in the same way as disloyal. These are this has also led to disappearance of people.
So on the criteria for confinement, it sounds like I can't believe that they think that the criteria they're using, family members traveling abroad, buying Qurans and so on are kind of, definitive evidence of subversive activity. But their thinking is just kind of statistically, if we cast the net this wide, we'll get a lot of people who, from our point of view, need to be dealt with in some sense. Now, the question is, what does the dealing with consist of?
Right.
Do you have a very clear idea of the extent to which what is going on in there is, do you have any sense what's going on in there? I assume that they actually do want them to speak more Chinese and less of their native language. So I gather there is Chinese language instruction or something, but do you have any sense for what's going on, what the actual conditions of living on or any of that?
They do talk quite openly about the sort of the kind of curriculum that exists in these centers, because, as I've touched on, they regard what they're doing as part of this global war on terror, and they see themselves as learning from and applying the lessons that they take from, de-radicalization campaigns elsewhere. And so they do talk about what people are getting in these camps. So one element, yes, the Chinese language. So not speaking Chinese is another factor that might, make you more likely to end up in these camps. And it seems to be that improving your Chinese to a certain level was a way that people felt was, likely to allow them to eventually get out. But also political, ideological.
Just to be clear, so passing a Chinese language proficiency exam could hasten the day when you are released from
That seems to have been part of the, because it's probably the case that the high point of these detentions has now passed. There have been increasingly, you hear from, Uyghur contacts, family members have been getting out, and periods of detention of around about 2 years seems to have been quite common. Now, not everyone by any stretch is out yet. But so then aside from language, you've got the political ideological education. And this is partly just about drumming in loyalty to the party, love for the party, and, opposition to anything the party deems to be harmful. It's about, the party has this notion that Uyghurs have been too cut off from the Chinese mainstream. So they simply don't know enough about the Chinese constitution, Chinese laws, and so on. And people need to be brought up to speed on that kind of thing. That seems to have been the focus initially. As the criticism of these policies increased and the party had to come out and defend them internationally, the emphasis shifted to this idea of vocational training, which has been taking place in some of these camps that people have been put into what sort of look like workhouse environments where they're working at, sort of light industrial factory environments, supposedly acquiring skills that will be, of use to them when they leave and go on and find factory employment. And this reflects, I mean, some of it's kind of ridiculous, the fact that people who have, because of course some of these people have very good jobs, in urban settings, and they don't need to be trained to use sewing machines or what have you. But the party has this basic hostility towards these traditional social environments, such as the Uyghur village, which they regard as impediments to the reach of the party and its ideology and so on. And so they want to pull people out of these environments and bring them into spaces where they'll have more contact with Chinese language, Chinese media. And
so they want to urbanize them in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, you could almost say they want to proletarianize them. In that sense, yeah. So, putting people into, and this connects to some of this is connected to the question of the detention centers, but there is this wider program of labor transfer and so on that's been going on for some time, to take what the state regards as surplus labor out of places like southern Xinjiang and send it to the Chinese interior or to the north of the region, to these urban factory settings. And that's also
essentially mandated. They just tell people they have to go work somewhere else.
Look, it's a really difficult question. I've seen evidence that certainly pressure is being applied in this recruitment process. And I think the whole program really, as a result, has to be considered somewhat tainted by that fact. Now, the question, I suppose, is, how much of this pressure is direct, pressure that, if you say no, we're going to, detain your family or detain you and you got to go. Certainly, I think it's definitely the case that local officials, they're given quotas to fill these programs and they have a lot of leeway. What goes on, right down at the local level is, often, out of the view of, officials elsewhere. I'm not willing to say that every single person in these programs is there against their will, though, because I think, for some people
in the labor programs, you mean?
In the labor programs, yeah. Right. So, when people write reports on these things, they talk about people who are at risk of, modern day slavery or, potentially.
Well, I was going to ask, so you hear the terms forced labor, even slave labor. What is actually happening on the ground that refers to? I mean, first of all, it's not slave labor in the sense that these people receive wages, right?
That's right. Yeah, they do.
So the question, I guess, is how the about the word forced, and it sounds like we're a little unclear, and it sounds like there's two different things going on. I mean, they might say incentivize, in quotes, people who haven't even been in these internment camps to relocate. But in addition to that, the people in the camps, some of them are receiving vocational training, and the state tries to direct their vocational path after they leave. Is that the other thing that is being referred to when people say forced or slave labor?
Yeah. So there does seem to be sort of industrial parks being set up to receive ex-detainees.
Do they consist entirely of ex-detainees? I mean, do we know?
No, I think that the party has been incentivizing factories and industries from the rest of China to relocate to Xinjiang for some time. And it's connected to a scheme that links particular cities in Xinjiang with provinces elsewhere. And that those provinces thereby sort of contribute to these, subsidies, and so on. And so, some of the, and so this is, as I say, this has been going on for some time. The questions surround questions like, how much freedom do people have to really choose, in these situations? And when they do find themselves in these new factories, do they have basic freedoms to decide, they don't want to work there anymore and go home, for example, that kind of thing, because these people are, often, whether that's in Xinjiang or elsewhere in China, they're kept in these compounds that are, quite cut off from the rest of the workplace. It's very hard to really get any, have any contact with these people.
So it's a way that the state is controlling the environment even after they've left the internment camp per se.
Yeah, that's right. And look, I think that, we have to consider that there are basic sort of economic forms of coercion at work here that, people might decide, well, given my options, this is, may not be great, but it's, I might make a bit more money than I am at home here, and so on. So I would allow for the possibility that, people are certainly signing contracts and so on when they go and do these things. But there's still, I think, a lot of questions to be asked. And, frankly, I hope that the Chinese government will allow people to go in and, and get a more precise sense of what's really going on in these situations. And companies who have any connection to this should be asking questions, and, and people should be putting pressure on them to say what they think is going on. Because I don't think that people in the West would be happy with the idea that they're buying products that are, coming from factories that are, involving this kind of abuse.
But at the same time, I've heard that when some companies respond to the pressure by ending the use of, say, all cotton from the region,
right,
that winds up hurting workers in a broader way without
sure.
But I don't know.
Yeah, look, I'm skeptical of the benefit of any kind of blanket trade embargo on Xinjiang or anything like that. And clearly, there's questions of corporate social responsibility in play here, but there's also a wider discussion going on about the application of sanctions. And that is something that I'm much more skeptical of in terms of decisions by governments in the West to just sort of ban products from this or that region. And yeah, because we know that there's no evidence when we look at the history that these kind of measures have really done anything to help vulnerable populations. So I'm much more interested in, avenues that we can continue to put pressure on companies and the authorities in China to if everything's great and everyone there is there sort of, voluntarily, like, well, that's fantastic. Like, let's just make sure that's the case and, provide us with the evidence.
Okay. So what about numbers? I've heard a range of estimates in terms of how many Uyghurs have been put in these camps. And I've also heard, from in some cases, there may be you could call these people defenders of the Chinese government. In other cases, they're just kind of skeptics of certain kinds of numbers. But I've heard the claim that there is a lot of reliance on a single source, a guy named Adrian Zenz. I'm sure you've heard the name. He's collected a lot of the data. He's at a think tank called the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which, as his critics point out, suggests that maybe, he has a certain ideology. Then again, everybody does. What do you, again, his estimates are at the high end of so you tell me, what do you make of all this? Do you think, what is the range? How many, first of all, how many Uyghurs are there in Xinjiang? Right. And then how many do you think have been put in these camps? And what do you have to say about the whole question of the reliability of the data, whether we're unduly reliant on one source or what?
Yeah. Okay. Well, there's about 11 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang. So that's around about 40% of the population now. This whole question of putting a figure on the number of detainees it's really been at the center of the discussion for a long time. And in some ways, I feel that it's unfortunate that, we went so early on to this question of, how many exactly. People came out with these estimates. And then, of course, that's where the debate centered, right? I have, big political differences with Adrian Zenz on all sorts of questions. And and I think it's unfortunate in some ways that he has, he's become really a lightning rod of criticism, partly just because of who he is and what he stands for, in terms of his, political and religious views. But it's not the case that Adrian Zenz is the only person putting forward information on this question. Now, it is the case that any estimate of the number of detainees involves a certain amount of extrapolation. Mm-hmm. It's involved, and there's been various methods applied to do that. Adrian Zenz is in fact not really at the the higher end of the estimates. I mean, I think he's sort of floated around between 1 and 1.5 million. I've heard estimates much higher than that.
Are there credible estimates that are lower?
No, I mean the estimate. I mean, for example, there's been an effort in by certain advocates to collect testimony. This is the Xinjiang victims database. And they have generally on their website, they have stuck to figure of, hundreds of thousands up to 1 million. And generally when I'm talking, that's where if I have to, give an estimate, but, we shouldn't really imagine that we would be able to give a precise estimate. It's like asking, in 1937, how many people has Stalin arrested? China has never come out and said how many people have gone through the camps. They have said that over the last, I think, 7-8 years or so, there's been, millions of people have received forms of political re-education. But that can include, stuff that just goes on at your workplace or whatever. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily give us a sense exactly of how many people have been through this. And as I was saying, the high point of this detention campaign has possibly passed. So I would imagine that, I don't think there are a lot of new detainees going in. What we need to be aware of, though, is that there's been this surge of incarcerations through the formal criminal justice system as well at the same time. And I think as we're looking forward, that in fact is going to be the thing that hangs around because people are receiving, 10, 15, 20 years in prison.
You mean in Xinjiang in particular, as opposed to in China broadly? And you think some of these are actually in jail because there's suspicion of separatist or terrorists?
I think that they've been identified as a category of, people who require firmer measures. Some of these people have spent time in the detention camps and then gone into prison. And we have a little bit of documentation for the kinds of cases that are going on. I've seen one set of documents about a guy who was given 10-year sentence simply for encouraging his workmates to pray, to be, to practice their religion. Otherwise, they would end up like the Chinese, right? And the fact that he used this comparison with Chinese was, he was, convicted for inciting, ethnic animosity. Mm-hmm. He got 10 years. There was a guy in the detention camps who, snuck off and prayed in an empty room. He was, discovered, and he was put in prison for that as well. So, I mean, this is something that I find particularly troubling, because this is going to require, efforts to release and rehabilitate these people for there to be any kind of justice. And that's going to be a long and difficult effort.
Do you think if it has passed its peak, is that partly in response to external pressure, or do you just think the government had the plan from the beginning? We're going to identify this category of people and
that's a really great question. And the honest answer is it's very hard for us to ever say, what connection external advocacy has to shifts in policy inside China. Now, I do think that they were discomforted by the response. I think that they expected that people would just say, oh, well, China's doing de-radicalization. We're doing de-radicalization too, good luck to them. That's, certainly hasn't been the response. And obviously it requires resources and effort to constantly defend yourself internationally when they'd rather be doing other things. And there has been a little bit of criticism from Chinese academics in the last couple of weeks. I saw there was a report in the South China Morning Post of some academics saying that, officials it was a sort of a typical thing, the policy is basically sound, but local officials on the ground have made a mess of things. And that was, that was new. I hadn't really heard that kind of talk. And so there may be some shift underway to revise or, redress some of the, some of the more egregious abuses going on. We can only hope that that's the case. But at the same time, I think China is pretty resolute in its determination to resolve what it sees as the problems here in its favor, because it has big plans for Xinjiang to internationalize, to sort of be a hub for, economic expansion through continental Eurasia, and so on. And it really holds all the cards. And I don't see a huge sign that there's the kind of real rethinking of the guiding philosophy and so on that we would like to see. I don't see much sign of that's taking place. And of course, China's not isolated on this issue. It has been able to mobilize international support for its position. It's being hammered by Western nations and a few others like Japan and so on, but it has been able to respond
by applying using economic leverage. Partly by using economic leverage.
I think, there's a lot of countries out there that actually share China's desire to, to prevent foreign countries, looking too closely at their domestic affairs. And I think that there's also a lot of countries that are just skeptical when a place like the United States raises the banner of human rights. A lot of countries have seen, where that can lead in the past. And just sort of.
You mean like invasion or bombing or what? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the instrumentalization of human rights issues for, America's geopolitical ends is a reality. And a lot of people around the world can see that. And I think that that's why, when we talk about this issue, it's really important that we try as far as we can to separate, advocacy and our response to this, which is, it's a situation of racism. It's a situation of discrimination. Separate that from, the wider field of US-China rivalry, which is, is all caught up with geopolitical interests. And that's not an environment that's going to be conducive, I think, ultimately to, pursuing justice and, for victims, for minority groups in vulnerable positions in China.
Okay. So I know you got to run, and yeah. I regret that. I want to try to squeeze in because I could keep talking about this. I want to squeeze in one more question. First I should say I think you've got a book coming out before long called China Panic, which perhaps is related to what you just said, which is. You tell me before I get to my final question. You want to say anything about that book?
Oh, look, it's a critique of the direction of Australian policy on China in the context of this US-China rivalry. But it's also, it's written from a progressive viewpoint that wants to find a way that we can stand up, for people who are suffering repression in China and, support the democratic rights of people in Hong Kong and so on without buying into this idea of a new Cold War between the US and China. That's basically what the book is about.
Okay, great. Yeah. And that's coming out when?
It'll be out in a couple of weeks, published by Black Ink here in Australia. But I'd be delighted if listeners or viewers in America had an interest in the situation here or the US-China politics more generally. There's a chapter on Hong Kong and chapter on Xinjiang in the book as well.
Great. So the final question I wanted to squeeze in was, do you think the Chinese, well, if you have time for two, my two burning questions are, do you think the Chinese government wants to actually extinguish the Uyghur language, or they just want what they consider culturally assimilated bilingual people? That's the one question. And
right.
The other question was going to be like how this is perceived by the Chinese population broadly. I'm guessing there's a fair amount of tolerance for the policy, but maybe I'm wrong in the Chinese population. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the party is basically indifferent to the future of the Uyghur language. I think that it would, its place publicly, I've seen photos of signs that were bilingual or the Uyghur text removed. There are technically laws that signs need to have both languages, but I don't think anyone is enforcing that these days. And I think they'd be happy for Uyghur to sort of end up as a kitchen language, where people could, have a, chit chat with their family and so on, but would not. I think the transmission of high level literacy, in terms of reading and writing and, academic discourse and, scientific publications and so on in Uyghur, that's the kind of thing where I think there are question marks about its survival.
Okay.
I'm sorry, what was the second question?
Is it the case that the Chinese population pretty broadly is fine with the government's policy here?
Yeah, there's actually not a high level of knowledge really elsewhere in China about what's going on, because it hasn't been, it hasn't been reported widely. It hasn't been. Now, I think that now China is, responding, talking back to the Western media on these issues. I think that is contributing to people, gaining an awareness that there's something going on. And I think that people will respond to that, in light of their general, stance towards the party. I mean, people who are skeptical may well be inclined to develop a certain sympathy for the victims of this policy. People who, there is a level of there's a level of sort of popular racism towards Muslim Turkey-speaking groups in Xinjiang that could certainly sustain support for these kinds of policies. There have been these interesting episodes, though. There was, the app Chat House a couple of weeks ago when it was accessible from China for a brief window, and there was some interesting dialogues taking place there between Chinese people inside China and Uyghurs and Chinese outside China. Now, that's not necessarily representative of public opinion in China, but there was quite a lot of sympathy and regret being expressed by Chinese people there. And I think that's another reason why when we talk about this issue in a place like Australia or the US, we need to really make clear that this is about, our concern around this kind of thing is about a concern for justice for all, not about a campaign to contain China's rise, because we have the opportunity, of course, to talk to a lot of people from China, in our societies, in our midst, that, in ways that are very difficult for us to, do in China itself. Like, we can't talk to people directly in China very easily about this issue, but there are Chinese people out there in these societies who are willing to listen. As someone who works at a university with a lot of Chinese students, that's something that I've been trying to do myself over the last couple of years.
Yeah. So, engagement. Of course, the Chinese government is famously not transparent, but engagement with China brings a certain amount of transparency, right? A certain kind. Does that?
As long as people don't sort of, drop the issue or go quiet on it for the sake of engagement, which of course is the sort of the critique that, but yeah, I don't see there are people out there, of course, now who say we need to decouple from China, we need to cut our ties, across the board and so on. And I don't think that's going to help anyone. I think that plays into the hands of hardliners and cold warriors on both sides of this, on both sides of this confrontation. Yeah.
What I meant was that the informal channels of communication that result from, say, scientific collaboration and so on in a subtle way can give us a clearer idea of what's going on inside the country. But you're right that there is the opposite danger of people, for the sake of engagement, declining to say anything or even be inquisitive about what's going on. Okay, so I appreciate I know this is past your kind of deadline for actually ending the conversation. I appreciate you sticking around. This has been very illuminating. So your existing book is called Uyghur Nation, which I'm sure provides a certain kind of background for this from Harvard University Press, and then And then you've got the book China Panic, which has a chapter on this very subject coming out within, probably within a week of when this will actually post, I would guess. So people can pre-order. All right. Well, thanks so much, David. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Bob. I enjoyed the conversation.